Welcome to the Unpacking Biblical Truth podcast, where through our Bible teaching series, we unravel the layers of biblical truth, one episode at a time. Let's journey together through the depths of Scripture. Here's Pastor Gomez.
Thank you for joining us in our study of the book of Genesis. Today we're in Genesis chapter 30. We begin in the first verse of Genesis chapter 30, where it says, "Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, 'Give me children, or else I die.'" Now, isn't this interesting? Here we see that she's mad at him now for her not having any children. And even though she's got beauty, and even though she's got the love of her husband, we see that this isn't enough. She wants to be able to have children as well. So she complains to Jacob. And verse 2 says, "And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel. And he said, 'Am I in the place of God, who has withheld you from the fruit of the womb?'" He's like, "Why are you blaming me? I'm not God." He says, "Everything's working on my end. I think the issue is in the mirror." And we see him respond in a way that's partially cruel, and then again, it's absolutely true in saying that God has closed your womb. He says, "I'm not in God's place. I can't open your womb." And we don't understand why God chooses to bless some people with children and withhold others. But we see here that Rachel's heart's desire is to have children. And her focus is upon this, and it's out of balance. And she's out of balance because she's so focused on what she doesn't have that she's no longer able to appreciate what she does have. Leah would give anything to have the love of Jacob like Rachel has. But Rachel counts it as a small thing because she doesn't have any children. And we can get to a point in our life where we're seeking after something that we want and we desire. And what ends up happening is that we lose our contentment from appreciating what we do have. And we see that when we start to focus on what we don't have, we lose our peace and we lose our contentment and we lose our ability to be thankful to God for the things that He's already given to us. And now Rachel becomes difficult to get along with relationally because of this. Her emptiness, it frustrates her and everybody around her. And oftentimes, this same dynamic can play out in our own lives. We get in a funk and we make everybody else feel funky. It's so important. And I'm not saying it's easy, but how important it is that we remain surrendered to God's will. And that we continue to be thankful for what we have. And that we stay in a place of contentment in our lives. And that we would count our blessings. Amen. In verse 3, we see that she's still not happy because she wants a child, she wants a child, she wants a child. Verse 3, "So she said, 'Here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her.' Then she gave him Bilhah for her maid as wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, 'God has judged my case, and he has also heard my voice and given me a son.' Therefore she called his name Dan. And Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, 'With great wrestling I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed.' So she called his name Naphtali." The custom back then was that if you couldn't have a child, you would take your maid and they would act as a surrogate. And when you gave birth, you would be on the knees of the other person. And then the child would come out and would be handed over to you as your child. And we see here that out of desperation, Rachel acts out in the flesh, just as Abraham and Sarah did with Hagar. And in verse 9, Leah responds and says, well, two could play at that game. Verse 9, "When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob as wife. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "A troop comes." So she called his name Gad. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, "I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed." So she called his name Asher. Here we see that the score is now 6-2. And this game of let's see who can have more kids is just getting out of control. Verse 14 says, "Now Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, 'Please give me some of your son's mandrakes.'" Mandrakes is a rare root, and it was called love apples. And it was thought that it would increase fertility. And we see that Leah's son Reuben finds these mandrakes, and Rachel wants some of this. And verse 15 says, "But she said to her, 'It is a small matter that you have taken away my husband. Would you now take away my son's mandrakes also?' And Rachel said, 'Therefore, he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes.' When Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, 'You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes.' And he lay with her that night." And so they enter into this bargain. And Leah's like, "What do you want? You already have Jacob's love. You have everything. You win. You want my son's mandrakes also?" And we see the pain in Leah's heart. And Rachel's so focused on herself that she offers her husband for the night. And what gets me is that Jacob's not passing up on any of this. He lays with this one and this maid and that maid, and he doesn't know how to say no. And even though this was an accepted custom in that day, it just doesn't make it right. There's a saying that says, "Don't mistake the will of the majority for the will of God." The fact that a custom is socially accepted doesn't mean it's wise or right. We can spare a lot of heartache by looking at potential consequences due to our actions. And it's important that we ask ourselves, am I doing anything right now that might cause future problems? Verse 17 goes on to say, "And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, 'God has given me my wages, because I have given my maid to my husband.' So she called his name Issachar." Verse 19, "Then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. And Leah said, 'God has endowed me with good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons.' So she called his name Zebulun. Afterwards she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah." Here we see that Leah never loses hope that her husband's going to love her. And she continues to seek the love of her husband through the quantity of her sons. And then we see that a daughter is born as well, and her name is Dinah. Verse 22 says, "Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son and said, 'God has taken away my reproach.' So she called his name Joseph and said, 'The Lord shall add to me another son.'" Here we see that God has taken away her reproach. And that's what Joseph means. God answered Rachel's prayers, and he gives her a child of her own. But in the meantime, she had given her servant to Jacob. And you know what? I understand that waiting on God is a difficult thing to do, but it's harder to live with the consequences of taking matters into our own hands. Verse 25 says, "And it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, 'Send me away that I may go to my own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service which I have done for you.'" Jacob knows that it's time to go back to the land of promise. He's served and fulfilled his 14 years for his wife. It was 14 years ago that he was given the dream, Jacob's ladder, and it was 14 years ago that God had given him a promise. And so he talks to his father-in-law and he tells him, well, sir, it's time to go. Send me away that I may go to my own place. Verse 27. And Laban said to him, please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. Then he said, name your wages, and I will give it. Here we see that Laban says, please stay, because I know that I'm being blessed because you're here. He says, you're the reason for my blessing. And he says, I know by experience. But that's misleading, because in the Hebrew, that word means by divination. And so Laban was practicing in the occult, and it was revealed to him that the source of his blessing is Jacob. And he doesn't want the source of his blessing to leave him. So he says, name your price and I'll pay it. Verse 29. So Jacob said to him, you know how I have served you and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little, and it has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming. And now, when shall I also provide for my house? So he said, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything, if you will do this thing for me. I will again feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all of your flock today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep, and all the brown ones among the lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages. So my righteousness will answer for me in time to come, when the subject of my wages comes before you. Everyone that is not spotted or speckled among the goats, and brown among the lambs, will be considered stolen if it is with me. Here we see that Jacob asks Laban for all the spotted and speckled sheep and goats, with every black lamb, and their distinctive markings allow these animals to be easily distinguished from those that belong to Laban. In verse 34, we'll see that Laban agrees to it. And Laban said, oh, that it were according to your word. So he removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted, and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white in it, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and gave them into the hand of his sons. Then he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. Now that the flocks are split, Jacob is going to continue to oversee both sets of flocks. And verse 37 says, now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar, and of the almond and chestnut trees, peeled white stripes in them, and exposed the white which was in the rods. And the rods which he had peeled he set before the flocks in the gutters, in the watering troughs, where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink. So the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth streaked, speckled, and spotted. Then Jacob separated the lambs, and made the flocks face toward the streaked, and all the brown in the flock of Laban. But he put his own flocks by themselves, and did not put them with Laban's flock. Here we see that Jacob had his own method for breeding flocks. And where he got it from, I have no clue. The only interpretation I have for this is that God blessed him, and his flocks were being multiplied and were stronger. Verse 41 says, and it came to pass, whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous, and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. Here we see that Jacob practices a selective breeding method to ensure that the striped, speckled, and spotted sheep and goats come from the strongest animals in the flocks. And the bottom line of it is that God was blessing him regardless of the method Jacob used. And he becomes exceedingly prosperous. So we leave Jacob at a place where he has his wealth, he has his family, and now it's time to go back to the land of promise. Except there's one problem with returning back to the land of promise. You remember that his brother, he still wants to kill him. And whenever we run away from a problem or situation, it never does take care of itself. There comes a time where we're going to have to deal with those conflicts, and we'll get to that next time. I hope this study has ministered to you and finds you well. And now may the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace.